Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining us on day two of JNUC. This session is Jamf Pro at Scale, and I'm joined by a whole bunch of very smart Jamfs that I'm going to briefly introduce, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So we've got Greg Mackey. Go ahead and just wave, thank you. Matt Anderson, Brock Walters, Brian Larson, who's right behind me, Matt Woodruff, Mikey Paul, Ryan Yonk, and Doug Worley. And they all have various technical roles at Jamf, and they are here to kind of discuss and answer questions that you have brought with you. So Mikey Paul is going to be our moderator today, and I'm going to hand off a mic to Matt Woodruff because he's sitting here very politely.
And go.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming. We have a few slides that we'll click through, but generally this is the goal is this is just an open discussion. So obviously some of you care about scaling. So I don't know if there's any questions right away that we want to talk about in specific, if anybody's feeling ambitious, or we can kind of start clicking through a few of our base topics.
The mics are up here up front. Also, if you can't get to a mic, flag me down. I'll bring one to you.
I had a topic just to start off with in conversation. We currently manage everything on-prem, and we have about 4,000 Macs. And with all the programs that we're about to instigate with our Jamf instance, we're instigating self-service and a whole bunch of other programs, Mac Choice for all users. I am kind of over managing the infrastructure, and I'm done with it. Honestly, SQL, really cool to learn. Tomcat, Java, all this stuff's really cool technologies. But for when I'm thinking of scale and scalability in my organization, I'm looking at Jamf Cloud, and I'm like, okay, what should I be looking at in terms of benefits with either going to cloud and allowing management of the infrastructure to be handled by someone else versus starting to scale that? Because I'm estimating in 2 years we'll probably be around 10 to 15,000 devices. We're at 4,000 devices right now, so just kind of food for thought. Maybe your opinions on it.
I think it might be on.
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the biggest benefits that we see out of customers being hosted in the cloud is the availability of tools for us as engineers at Jamf to support customers in that environment. And so we have monitoring, like very heavy-duty monitoring set up on those environments that gets us internals of Java memory pools and things like that we can kind of watch and diagnose off of. We have the ability to do profiling on those machines. So anyways, not only is the infrastructure set up to scale with at least 2 nodes for HA, we also have all this stuff in the background kind of helping us support it. And that's a big part of scaling. And big part of scaling is doing the monitoring, knowing what's going on in the environment so you can take action and do the right stuff. Like you don't add 4 cores if you don't need 4 cores, but the monitoring tells you, yeah, you need 4 more cores on this machine. So that's really big. I'd say that's, to me as a technical person, somebody who works on the cloud stuff a lot, like that's a huge advantage of being hosted.
Do you want to add about also RDS and the benefit of why we chose Amazon and some of those things that we're gaining there?
Good. Yeah.
In particular, I mean, database scaling is obviously going to be a question here that comes up often.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in the cloud, we do use RDS, which is it's an Amazon technology, but they're just kind of wrapping a bunch of stuff to make managing the data easier. So there's kind of quick and easy snapshots that end up being your backups. So if we need to pull back an old version of the database, it's not like getting a MySQL dump and restoring that. It's simply flipping a switch, essentially, and restoring that snapshot. It's a managed service by Amazon, so they're kind of on the hook to keep that up for us. So, were you thinking anything else for that, or?
It's just some of the added benefits that we get.
Yeah.
I mean, some other people have set that up with their own Amazon clouds as well, but that's one of the reasons we benefit from it as well.
Sorry. Oh, jeez. Morning, everyone. The one other thing I guess I'll say to add on to Matt's is that as we kind of look forward to embracing the cloud as one of our top tier platforms, we're looking at AWS and the tools that it provides and being able to build and leverage some of those tools. So things like Amazon SQS, things like the Elastic Cache in the cloud, right? Those are things that we're looking forward into the future. And we have no intention of prohibiting people from on-prem using those, but you're either going to use have to reach out for cloud resources to actually use those, or we're going to build something in the application that will still support a 100% on-prem instance, but it's not going to work to the same level that it would if you're using those scalable, large cloud services. So.
One of the additional things that I get asked constantly about is, as I make this transition to the cloud, what are the concepts that I need to be able to return for ROI, TCO, that's going to affect my environment? And as you guys have learned, scaling these types of solutions, you'll find a lot of FTEs getting applied to those technologies. And then on top of the FTEs, you also have licensing costs. Yes, please. My apologies. With me covering the federal government space, I use a lot of acronyms constantly. So full-time employees that you're paying constant salaries to monitor these efficiencies as you're going through scaling this up for your environment. What I would say is just rely on us. We know how to scale our product extremely well, and we're first masking that to our cloud solution, first and foremost. And as we continue to monitor that, you're going to find those efficiencies as you are deploying that type of cloud solution in your environment, and then you guys get to focus on more of your end user experience constantly.
Just one brief thing to add to that is, in direct answer to your question, that if you are planning on staying with on-prem, you definitely have to consider that additional investment that you would have to make in terms of the solutions that it wouldn't necessarily have to be as scaled up as Jamf Cloud is, because we're obviously providing services to many, many, many customers. But you do have to consider the additional costs of doing that and having monitoring solutions in place that can give you the information that you need about an on-premise solution the same way we run our show, basically.
When I'm on site with customers helping them plan out how to do this, the question of how much of a server admin using CGA, Jamf 350 level information on your daily jobs you want or need to do versus, could you offload the database management to a team that has DBAs on staff? And you take that idea of offloading that responsibility to free up your daily work to spend more time in the policy engine, making sure that your endpoints are where you want to be, can free up a lot of consternation and mental anguish. So by taking that discussion even further out to the cloud, yeah, absolutely, it would put that onus on us to make sure that we provide you with a stable Jamf Pro environment.
One more benefit from the support guy. So at Jamf, we've got an opportunity for someone to pick up the phone to listen to what your organization is going to do in the immediate future plans. You might be planning to roll out an app to everything that you manage, or enroll a bunch of new devices. We hope that we're approachable and we've got a cadence of conversation and a sense of openness where you're feeling comfortable, where you can treat us as an extension of your team. Pick up the phone. Hey, Jamf guys, I'm planning to do this in the next couple of weeks. You got me? And what we do on the back end there is funnel that information, probably ask more questions about what we're really doing, but give consideration on the back end for the cloud setup to make sure that we're ready.
I actually have another question around scalability in our environment. So we're a global company. I work for Adidas, and we have 25 file share distribution points around the globe, and we just started with DEP and thinking about enrolling and configuring the device as opposed to traditional imaging workflows, mainly spurred on by High Sierra. However, one of the key things in going into now making our Jamf instance publicly available through the DMZ environment was going to Amazon, AWS, S3 Bucket, and CloudFront. One of the challenges that I face is in my infrastructure, mainly in South America, Africa, and some Asia countries, is bandwidth. I have major problems there, and while Apple has caching servers and support for their services, I don't see any direct support for a less hands-on and a more automated approach around helping areas that have low bandwidth and need to scale at a massive level. And so we can't fail over right now to cloud distribution points when you have network segments set up. And it's been a feature request for a long time. And what kind of support or suggestions can you make to circumvent this? I'm looking at things like using riverbeds and other technologies, because frankly I don't want to touch it. I just want it to work and work best for the users. So what suggestions or areas have you seen with people you work with that can help with those kind of things?
So most oftentimes this turns into distributing packages from local disks or file repositories, right? Yeah. Maybe we should clap for that, FR.
Yeah. I'm also with the customer advisory board and other stuff, and this is feedback that we've gotten a handful of times about the priority or need for failover to a cloud or other failover things. And believe me, we're talking about it and looking at it, but local things, right now that's not there. So we've seen different people have local scripts and other stuff checking availability of things and doing that. There's the amazing open source project Radar. It was a really neat concept that some people put out. R.A.D.8. It's all an acronym, but robust. I forget how it all stands for. But the concept is checking availability of distribution points and latency, and before actually making a call to do the download, it would pick the correct distribution point for that as well. So there are some different interesting concepts out there in the community to solve those problems until we do. But
one thing I've seen work well, which does not address your direct question about failover, but as far as distributed, automated syncing of things, there's a feature within Microsoft Networks, the DFS, Distributed File System, which we all know that Macs don't know how to negotiate the name abstraction. You have to specify the full URI of that share from CFS/whack server path /share name. And if you populate your Jamf Pro, another dollar in the bucket, with each of those instances as a separate file share distribution point, the Macs think it's just a SMB share, but you've got the automatic replication of that file space across your network. And if you're a global company, I'm going to guess you probably have a Windows server or two. Yeah, hundreds of thousands. So,
And we've seen a similar solution with Box.com, actually, that some people use that as their file share distribution point and configured it similarly to that. Another solution that customers have come up with is using torrent distribution, where they're using,
BT sync and...
Yep. Torrent is not it wasn't created for evil. It's just used for evil, right? So, so it is a viable solution, and there are customers that have that set up.
Sure.
So I got a couple of canned slides just to cover a few topics that might be some questions you have later on. We can maybe plant a couple seeds. First off, a couple things that have changed in the past year when it comes to scaled environments. A couple things between version 9 and version 10. Well, we'll talk about monitoring in just a little touch. So in the defaults from a new deployment, if you're to stand up a brand new Jamf Pro deployment, the value inside the database XML file for the max pool size used to be 90, and then it was 9.10, well, 99, yeah. We dropped it down to 45. Research with our online services team, they're playing around with these values and determined that by dropping that pool down, it made Tomcat more performant and it could process those queries more quickly. Now, we're not recommending that you go through and change all of your scale deployments automatically down to 45. Like, by changing that one value, that might have effects on other parts of your deployment. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're just noticing that going forward, this is a better starting point to move from. And then something else you may have heard of in the documentation, Memcache. So the rough analogy for how this operates is like a fusion drive in some of the new iMacs. You've got the quick read-write flash buffer that it goes to first to see if it knows where that value is, but then drops down to a slower read-write connection, in this case down to the database. So when Tomcat gets a request, it looks first to Memcache. If it's not in Memcache, then it makes the final query out to the database. Now, if you've got a clustered environment and you've got a Tomcat web app out in your DMZ, both Tomcat web apps will need to be able to talk to the Memcache server. That means that besides the 3306 port through your firewalls to get to your database server, you'll need to have another port open. The default port for that is 112.1.1. So that might be a discussion to have with network security. You know, like how many firewall holes do you want to push from your DMZ to your internal network? They're probably going to say not too many. So at this point, the Jamf Pro server in the DMZ architecture, if you're moving out to handle more client load, might consider moving it from this architecture to possibly something that looks more like this, where you've got a load balancer that handles all of the client traffic coming in, and then within your internal network, the load balancer can talk to Tomcat, and then the route from Tomcat to your database in Memcache, that's all a local route, which is usually a much easier conversation to have with your network security admins. Any questions about either of those two things?
A question on the Memcache. Beyond the default configurations for Memcache, have you guys come up with any changes to that improve performance or anything? Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, there is a config file. It's in etc memcache.conf or something like that. And there are values you can specify. It's a pretty straightforward configuration file. It's m dash and then a number of I think bytes that it takes. So it can be scaled vertically. We recommend at least 2 Memcache servers, and the config file for Tomcat, it just has just an array of paths and the ports that it talks to. So scaling vertically by adding more resources, yes, that can be done. Scaling horizontally by having multiples for redundancy and failover, also both good ideas for that. Besides that, any other specifics on configuring?
Did you have best practices at all, or anything like that yet?
We haven't developed any tweaks for that config at all.
Okay.
It's essentially been running with Memcache defaults so far everywhere, even in the cloud. I've been watching that pretty close. There's been some cases where the cache was getting hit hard, but that was actually a thing in the server, not a Memcache configuration problem. So again, it's about monitoring, and we are monitoring, and it's pretty efficient, and the base config seems pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, Memcache has some monitoring capabilities as well, and that's another benefit with our cloud is Amazon has their version, Elasticache, as well, that we are leveraging, and there's some functionalities in Elasticache that we get that we don't necessarily have everywhere else too, that we're building around as well.
Just one thing to add to the adding additional Memcache servers actually grows the size of the cache, right? It creates a distributed cache, so they don't just function as failover. Having 2 is not just like, so if one goes down, the other one works. You're actually increasing the total size of the distributed cache. So you can set up more than 2. The recommendation is for 2 in case one goes down, but you can theoretically improve performance also by increasing that total size of the distributed cache. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, we said no really good best practices, and then we're going to talk for about an hour on the topic. Just I guess a little look behind the scenes for the Memcache stuff, and you guys have kind of noticed we've been saying, hey, it's going to be a requirement for a while now. And what we're working on behind the scenes is actually slowly moving parts of our application over to this cacheable regime, right? And so there'll be a point in time in the future where we get to some core things in the application where then it's going to be the requirement. So we've been trying to prep you guys as much as we possibly can to say, hey, this infrastructure needs to be in place. But on the best practices thing, it's going to change as that kind of continues to roll out, right? As more things in the application become cacheable, and as a mobile device behaves much differently than a computer, right? Or behaves much differently than a user in our system. Users are looked up really quickly. You're doing VPP assignments, doing a deployment or something like that. Mobile devices check in on a frequency of about once every 5 seconds, right? And so, to reiterate kind of what Mikey and Matt had said, just making sure we've got monitoring in place at this point, and yeah, staying tuned to Jamf Nation or any news we have about that. So.
Next question.
To run Memcache on a dedicated box or on the same server as your Tomcat server?
With everything, separate servers is always, you get more benefit because Memcache will use resources as well that would potentially take away from your Tomcat or other stuff. It can work there locally, but obviously when you start scaling things with everything, if it's dedicated, it has more resources for itself.
But regardless of where you put that Memcache server, you'll need to make sure that each Tomcat server can route to each Memcache server. So it's a whole bunch of routes. So again, having it on the same local network, hopefully with as few network restrictions as possible, would definitely be the easiest configuration.
Yeah, and it's going to depend on kind of your current bottleneck too, for what's most applicable. I agree with these guys. Like in a perfect scenario, you've got dedicated machines for everything, but Memcache is going to help with the database reads and things like that. And so if you're making this decision based on how much is available on the machine, there's probably something to be said, like these guys are saying, that increasing the heap of Tomcat at that point in time might be more advantageous than making room for another service. But it's really going to depend on if you're seeing the SQL machine, usually with high CPU, lots of connections to that, then there might be an advantage to putting Memcache on the local machine, but that would probably be the only scenario that I can think of that would be the case. So.
And the question I had is that it seems like not a lot's being cached yet. Is there a recommendation for how much memory we should allot to Memcache, or does that scale along with your environment as well?
There's going to be, so what we're caching, I'll give you a very specific answer. So department objects, building objects, user objects. Oh boy, someone else from that team is probably in the room. Yeah, there's a bunch of little things in there too. I know we're working on sites right now, which will be big. And so I would say that it's got to be within the realm. I don't know that we have any specific best practices, but just thinking it through, there's probably a total amount of data that would be cached at any point in time. That would be some ratio of your database, right? So a quarter of that size. I don't think you'd ever exceed that. So.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, we operate a huge clustered environment, and we've seen since probably 996 onwards, every release is pushing more and more things onto the master node in the cluster. And I'm wondering what your view is as to whether that master node gets taken out of serving web pages, which is what we do, or whether you beef up the master node so that it's still doing those things are still serving, because we've seen it go from sort of web serving parts of a cluster having a load of sort of 0.05 to master nodes having a load of like 20, 30, 40.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this will be another one where I think a lot of us will talk. So good question. We've seen some of the higher availability and higher scale environments we've seen. They definitely have taken it out of serving web application requests. And I'll even go as far to say is probably some of the most success we've seen is actually to give those individual nodes like responsibilities, where these two are hosting client requests, these two are our UI, this is our master node. I've noted, it's a great thing, but we have a lot of integrations that hit our application pretty heavy through the API, right? And so if you're in a scenario like that, I know we're looking through some logs, and we what was it yesterday? We had one customer that had like 500,000 requests in a day to an API endpoint. So if you're in that scenario, then giving that a specific node would probably be advantageous as well. So absolutely yes to your question, and even more specialization. Some of that stuff can help. So
that is I'm the content owner for the 350 course, formerly known as the CJA. That is definitely the configuration that we teach in that course. That having kind of like back to what the other guys were saying about having dedicated services, right? If you can specialize the nodes in the cluster, that's very advantageous, and we definitely recommend that.
I just agree with everybody. That's a great way to lay stuff out. To split the nodes out if you can, and load balance out to specific jobs to the different nodes. One of our I guess dreams architecturally as engineers on the team is to maybe someday spread some of that load out between the nodes so the master doesn't have to do all that work. But it'll take it's a lot of back end work, and we're just in the beginning stages of kind of talking about how we would tackle that. But for now, the idea of giving the nodes specific roles, maybe taking the master out of the load balancer, so it doesn't get client traffic, is a good way to go.
Just a follow-up question from that: is there any development plans for failover of master nodes?
No.
Easy question. Thank you.
So quick follow-up on his, it sounded like you just answered it, but to dedicate the roles, it's just a matter of putting in the right load balancer. There's no other configuration you do, right? Okay.
Right.
Cool. Okay. The question that I had was, and it's been 1 or 2 months since I've looked at it, so something could have changed by then. I apologize if that's true, but there was 1 or 2 database tables that, this is back on Memcache, sorry. 1 or 2 database tables that contain information about what your caching servers are. So are they there because eventually this will be something configurable in the web app? Or I've noticed also in the configuration files, like it will read in like source from database. What's that design all about? What's the intention there? Where's it going?
No, what you're kind of seeing is an artifact of our cloud deployment at that point. I believe the cloud deployment required us to put in the XML file, and but for the customers, we wanted it in the database. And so I think either or is fine. Nuking that's good. Otherwise, putting it in the web application is probably going to be your safest bet. So.
To clarify on that, like the files are there because we don't want to access your database on our cloud hosted. We can make these settings and these changes by putting files in there with the settings, and it writes to your database because we don't enter your database when we're hosting you. So this was the ways we can implement that. That's why that's 2 ways to kind of go at that.
But there's no place in the web app to configure it now.
Correct, not currently, but that feedback's been given by us and by customers as well, of thoughts there with it.
That will be ideal for internal cloud or our own cloud deployments, because we can just set it to the Elasticache right there and not have to worry about configuring the files, because we have to regularly rotate our instances. So defining those on the fly is always a pain. So
My understanding of the way that works is that if that file, the configuration file is not populated, whatever is in the database is authoritative. So you can actually leave that blank.
okay,
Yeah.
cool, thanks.
Still on Memcache, if I'm not mistaken, you can still do monitoring through Telnet. Is that the best tool, or are there other recommended third-party apps that might be?
That is the one tool that I know that there's someone has created this PHP front end for it, which allows you to see kind of there's a stats command that you can run against Memcache, and there's someone has created a PHP front end for that. If anybody knows other tools,
how would you find that?
There's JMX on the client side, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So there's a little bit you can monitor on the client side. So on the JSS side, there's I don't know if you've done anything with JMX. It's Java Management Extensions. It's kind of a way to
just
get
console, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some data on the Memcache client inside the server that you can look at there through JMX, but it's not actual server data that you'd get out of the telnet connection. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Two real quick ones. Going back to the discussion of splitting out admin API, client facing, is there any work being done on allowing SSO for split URL? Because right now with like Okta or anything like that, if you have Okta enabled, you can't do that.
Correct.
Is there work being done on it?
Yeah, sorry, but yes, it is actually actively in development. I can't say when it's coming, but that's been heard, and they're assigned to sprints. Like things are being worked on to help solving with some of that.
Okay. And second, real quick one: is there any plan to release some of the monitoring? Going to the monitoring discussion at the beginning, any discussion around releasing some best practices around if you're hosting your own AWS or Azure or anything like that for monitoring?
Yeah, we're actively going to start. We're going to work on getting the JMX basics out right now. It has been added to the 350 course, the CJA. We're working on some KBs. Anybody can feel free to reach out to me, Mike.Paul@Jamf, and I'm willing to shoot you basic setup right now just to kind of get things running till we get the KB up. But
when we formed this group, like this is like a group that got together to start talking about this stuff, and one of the biggest things we identified is just you have to know what's going on. You have to have monitoring set up, and so we talked quite a bit about that. And if you look at the slide here, the one that we kind of have some docs started on, and potentially we'd maybe even have an appliance that we would help support out in the open source world, that you could just easily set up, Zabbix or something like Nagios to monitor your stuff. So we're shooting for that because we see in our day-to-day interactions when servers are going down how critical having that historical performance monitoring data is. So that's something that's really important to this group, and a few of us are continuing to push on that so you guys get the information you need to set that up right.
Excellent, thanks.
yeah, but that's came up a couple times, so I will make that top priority for me next week to get working on getting the at least basic JMX set up for a KB. It's pretty straightforward when you see it. It's some options you add to your essentially your tomcat setting, so your set env.sh or your tomcat plist. It's some Java variables. Again, on here, yep, it's right there on the screen. So those things that we're looking, you modify them there, and some basic ideas of what we kind of see with this is JConsole that's built into Java. Anywhere you have Java or JDK installed, there's a JConsole app that you can launch, and you say, all right, you connect to this server at this IP address, and if you set it up with credentials, use these credentials, and then you can monitor this stuff historically, and actually get a good idea that when I add this policy or I do this thing, you see this ramification in your environment, and you can actually start knowing where is it running out of resources, where do I need to tweak it, where do I need to go up more. So this is just basic JConsole built in. This is a Zabbix screen, again, showing other ways of monitoring. So Zabbix allows you to connect in over JMX and get that. But then you got these tools like Nagios and Zabbix that also have their own agents that you can install on these servers and actually get even more information out. Both Zabbix has Tomcat and MySQL plugins and other things that you can historically watch the impact of your environment and what happens when you see spikes at certain times or other stuff. And that's where we can actually accurately make decisions on what to implement and change, is being based off of the data. And that's where it helps us in the cloud, is we watch it and we see where we need to tweak and where we need to improve.
For instance, one of the things I mentioned earlier, watching the internal Java memory pools and things like that, one of the things we've been watching recently with a really, really good friend and customer that's been working with us on some issues is watching the garbage collection time in Java. So as we create objects, we go to deploy policies, configuration profiles, things like that. Those objects are in memory, and when we no longer need them, then Java comes through and has a process to collect that garbage and reclaim that memory. There's times where that garbage collection is a really heavy load on the system and is kind of a big deal, but it can be hidden. It just looks like high CPU. Yeah, I just pushed out a profile or something to all devices. Sure, the CPU is high, but what might actually be happening is the deployment occurred, and now what we're facing in the CPU graph is actually the back end Java stuff going to collect all the memory back again. So like being able to zero in on these specifics is just really critical to figuring out what's going on in the environment, how you might need to change your heap settings or something like that for Java. So Mikey, you flip back to this one. I guess, yeah, it doesn't really show that necessarily.
No, I was hoping it did,
yeah,
but
yeah.
This information here is showing what a Tomcat restart looks like.
yep. So that's the peak and the drop that you see there, and things coming back up. But you can see, I mean, you can let it run for days, weeks, months, and it was, as mentioned, the other panel or the other discussion was do it at normal time so you can get baseline, and then make sure you're monitoring when you're going to make a change or you do a big push and seeing what those impacts are. You need to know what your baseline normal running is before you know if you're running hot.
The point is not to have pretty graphs, although everyone does love them. But the trick is aggregating this information with your logs, right? I just did a thing, and now the computer did that thing. That's what's difficult to get now with just looking at logs. But if you have a tool like this in place, you get to see what happened on the server when you did a thing.
Okay. We have nicely balanced out everything with many web app hosts. So that works perfectly fine, but they still are hammering the same SQL server, all of them. So what are technologies that are successfully used to load balance SQL, like SQL proxy, something like this?
Yeah, at this point, we don't have, for a long time, we've known that our single point of failure in this case is the SQL machine. At this point, we don't have any support for any other engines or databases. And that's why we've been making a push to Memcache, because that is a nice scalable solution to at least alleviate some of the pressure from that. But we've heard pretty clear over the last day that some type of fault tolerance and redundancy and scalability on the database side is big for people. So,
but just master-slave SQL and then a failover, that would be what you would recommend?
As well as changing the pool sizes potentially. If you find that CPU does get pegged really hard on the MySQL server, you may find that you want to lower the number of connections that you allow to the MySQL server to kind of help lower the actual load on the server.
Okay, thanks.
Hi guys. I have a question about geographic distance between Tomcat nodes and specifically like ping latency. Especially with Memcache involved. I've heard some customers running nodes in multiple different locations. Can you just give us feedback on that and what's recommended?
I don't have anything super technical to say about that, but my inclination is to say that a lot of that has to do with how you have your load balancing configured, right? The money that you're paying for something like an F5 as opposed to using something like a software-only solution like Pound is that F5 has much more complicated algorithms for determining geographical distance, ping time, and then making the best decision on the fly about which node the traffic should be handled by. So I guess what I would say is buy an expensive load balancer.
But I don't see a lot of people doing remote nodes either, because I mean the heavy lifting, a lot of it's between Tomcat and MySQL, and you want Tomcat to be able to reach MySQL quickly. Like it's a lighter load for client to web app. The heavy load for client is distribution point generally.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I was going to add was the nodes don't talk. There's no communication between nodes besides through the database, and so just the statement of them being geographically separate isn't as big a deal as what are their hops to the database essentially. So.
Okay, yeah. However, does that mean that you would encourage customers with, say, global environments to be putting Tomcat nodes scattered around the world? No, I've always heard that's supposed to be basically one geographic point for check-in and then distribution points everywhere else, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's still the recommendation.
Sorry, yeah, it is.
Okay, all right, thanks.
In your AWS cloud for RDS, are you running read replicas as a live backup?
That's a great question for our DBA, Dave.
Yeah. Sorry. Sure, okay. Mike knows.
Yeah, it's kind of it's more of an RDS question, I guess, for me at that point. That sounds really familiar, and I think that's potentially how it works.
Okay,
We're
about to try it. I didn't know if there's any drawbacks. The other question I had, for those of us in our own AWS, if we have an auto scale group, it's kind of hard to take advantage of that, because when a new node starts up, you have to have it fully scripted to run the install, to do all the custom configurations, and you even have to do a curl against yourself to kind of warm it up before it's even seen in the limited access portion. I don't know if you're aware of that, but anyway. So we figured all that out. The one thing that we haven't figured out is how to define the role. So that's always a manual thing that somebody's got to go into the web app. I don't think there's an API call for that. I guess you could do a database call, but you guys always say not to do that. How do you handle that in your environments for auto scale groups? Like, do you just wait for a person to get a notification and go take action on it and sign the role, or
by role? Could you clarify?
Limited access versus full admin.
Like at this point, I don't think we do any customization of the web application, since that's kind of a customer setting in the cloud that anyone. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Like we don't have limited access in the offering in the cloud. So.
But
okay.
But
So,
we also
gotcha.
For the EC2 instances that we actually do spin up, we have a set amount, and I don't think we use any of the Elastic Beanstalk or any of the auto scale groups for that as well.
So I've made the request a couple times, but we'd love to see an installer with like a configuration file option. So you say JSS installer run -c, point to your file that's got all your custom settings there. It just sets itself up.
Yeah, right. For the limited access one, I will say that's in the database now, right?
It is.
Yeah. So if you knew the IP address, I guess you could maybe make that, but that's tough to know the IP address before it gets spun up. Yeah. So.
We have stories on engineering backlogs too to work on that configuration, so that you can do kind of that pre-setup stuff ahead of time and not have to touch the database. So those are things we're tracking and wanting to get to, because it's useful in our cloud as well. So.
One more general comment for anyone that's actually looking to do the deployment to AWS. If you guys want to own that, please hit us up. We have tons of information from trial and failure and experience for what works in AWS and what doesn't. And so we very much encourage you to reach out to us through your support rep. I guess that would be a good, and we'd probably be happy to sit down with you guys and talk about what's best practice for us. So.
Also to that same point, we asked this question in the tuning session yesterday about my IceM versus InnoDB. And yeah, you knew this was coming. Because I know running in RDS, in order to get point-in-time snapshotting going, you have to be fully InnoDB. So we're still recommending my IceM at this point. Is that going to flip?
Yes. Sorry, but yes, absolutely. At this point, especially, like it's. There's a couple reasons that my IceM is still the default for what we ship, but honestly, for this group, like we're talking about a legacy database that's not even ACID, right? And so there are some advantages to it in certain scenarios, but if you're talking about scale, InnoDB, absolutely 100%. And we're specifically looking at, in 2018, making that the default and probably just deprecating my IceM altogether as a supported technology. So.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap this up just a minute early. Thank you so much for all your very thoughtful questions. Thank you, Greg, Matt, Brock, Brian, Matt, Dave, who didn't make it, not appearing in this film, Mike, Ryan, and Doug. The next session in this room is at 1:30, Advanced Zero Touch DEP. So 1:30, and if you're ready for lunch, I think it's being served right out front. Thank you all.